In the spring of 1882, a block of marble weighing 6 tons left the ground at the base of the Washington Monument and began to climb. It rose on a single steam hoist, up a shaft of hollow stone, toward an iron frame bolted 400 feet in the air. Once it landed, that entire iron frame, cranes and all, would be jacked another 20 feet higher and bolted down again, so the next course could rise above it. All of this happened decades before hydraulics, before tower cranes, before a single power tool ever reached a job site. And still, one stone at a time, this became the tallest thing humanity had ever built. Today, we want to show you how. Over the next half hour, we are going to climb this monument from the bottom up, with the men and the machines that raised it. We will start in the river mud of the first foundation, move through the strange 20 years when the whole tower stood half-finished and abandoned, and then follow the steam machine that finally carried it into the sky. Along the way, we will stop at the moment the tower nearly lost a quiet fight underground, and we will end at what was, for one day, the most valuable small object in the country, a little metal point that still sits at the very top. This is, to our minds, one of the most overlooked engineering stories in America, so stay with us, because the most surprising part of it is buried where nobody can see it. To understand the machines, we first have to understand why this took so painfully long. The idea of a monument to George Washington was almost as old as the country itself. Within days of his death in 1799, Congress talked about building something grand in the new capital. Then they did what governments so often do with grand ideas. They argued, they delayed, and for the better part of 40 years, they built nothing at all. So in the end, it was not the government that started it. It was a group of private citizens. In 1833, they formed the Washington National Monument Society, with the Chief Justice of the United States as their first president. And they came up with a way to pay for it that sounded wonderfully democratic. Every American could give $1. Just one. The idea was that the whole nation would own a piece of it. The reality was slower and harder. Over about 15 years, those $1 gifts added up to roughly $230,000, which was real money at the time, but nowhere near enough for what the society had in mind. What they had in mind came from an architect named Robert Mills, the first native-born professional architect this country ever produced. His design was enormous. He pictured a flat-topped obelisk rising 600 feet, and wrapped around its base a great circular hall of 30 stone columns, more than 100 feet tall, with Washington himself standing above it in a chariot. The whole thing would have cost around $1 million, a staggering sum for the 1830s. They could not afford the hall. They could barely afford the obelisk, so they quietly dropped the columns and kept the simple stone shaft, the shape we know today, and even that would test them to the very limit. Mills himself would not live to see any of it finished. He died in 1855 in reduced circumstances, and to this day, his name appears nowhere on the monument he designed. The cornerstone went down on the 4th of July, 1848. The crowd that day included men who would later become president, Buchanan, Lincoln, and Johnson among them, along with the widows of Madison and Hamilton. And then the slow, heavy work began. There was even a problem with where to put it. The original city plan called for the monument to stand at a precise point, directly in line with the Capitol and the President's house. But when surveyors tested that exact spot, they found the ground there was too soft and marshy to trust with so much weight. So the builders shifted the whole monument a short distance onto firmer ground. To this day, the Washington Monument does not stand quite where it was meant to. Now here is the first thing most folks get wrong about how this tower went up. They picture nothing but men with ropes and muscle, and in the very beginning, that is partly true. The early stones were lifted with block and tackle, and wooden derricks swung into place by hand, and the whole structure was held together by little more than its own colossal weight and the friction between the stones. But by the end of 1849, something more modern had already arrived on the site. A steam engine of 70 horsepower was hauling the marble up to the top of the rising shaft. So even in the 1840s, the Washington Monument was, quietly, a steam-powered machine. The walls themselves were a clever piece of engineering hiding in plain sight. This was never a solid block of marble. It was built as two walls in one. On the outside, a skin of cut white marble, the face the world would see. On the inside, a second wall of rough gneiss, a hard local stone. And between them, a thick filling of rubble and mortar. At the base, those combined walls were about 15 feet thick. The marble was set in hydraulic cement, and the joints between the blocks were kept so tight that the line where one stone met the next was no wider than a pencil mark. Men called hod carriers hauled the wet mortar up the ramps on their shoulders, 80 to 100 pounds at a load, all day long, for wages of just a couple of dollars a day. If these are the kinds of stories that brought you to this channel, the forgotten machines and the men who ran them, take a second to like and subscribe. We have a great many more of these still to tell, and it genuinely helps us keep finding them. By the early 1850s, the shaft had climbed to about 150 feet, and then everything fell apart. The money ran dry, the society was nearly broke, and into that vacuum stepped one of the stranger chapters in American politics, a secretive anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic movement whose members, when asked about their group, were told to answer only that they knew nothing. People started calling them exactly that, the Know-Nothings. In 1854, they managed to take over the Monument Society itself. Their fingerprints are still part of this story, in two ways. First, a stone. Pope Pius IX had sent a block of marble from an ancient Roman temple as a gift for the monument, to be set into its walls like the gift stones that had been arriving from states and nations all over the world. One night in March of 1854, a group of men, almost certainly tied to that movement, stole the Pope's stone, hauled it off, and by every account dumped it into the Potomac River. It was never recovered. A reward was offered. Nobody was ever convicted. The replacement stone you can see in the monument today was not set until 1982, well over a century later. The Pope's stone was only one of many. As the tower had gone up, the Monument Society had invited states, cities, foreign governments, and private groups to send blocks of stone to be set inside the walls, each one carved with a name or a message. Close to 200 of these memorial stones were eventually built into the interior. The Ottoman Sultan sent a large, elegantly inscribed block from across the world. The American states sent their own. There is even a stone tied to a small kingdom in the Pacific, carried back to America by a United States naval expedition. To climb the inside of the Washington Monument today is to pass a wall of gifts from half the world, frozen in marble and granite. Second, the stone they added. During their brief control, the Know-Nothings laid a few feet of cheap, inferior masonry on top of the shaft. It was so poor that when serious engineers finally returned, they tore that whole section back out and started again from good stone. And then, for more than 20 years, almost nothing happened at all. The society lost its grip. the country fell into civil war, and the half-built tower simply sat there on the mall, a blunt stump of marble going gray in the weather. For a time, the surrounding grounds were used as a livestock yard, with cattle grazing at the foot of the unfinished national monument. The writer Mark Twain looked at it and sneered that it resembled a factory chimney with the factory left off. That is what the Washington Monument was for the better part of a generation. An embarrassment. A stub. That is the end of the first chapter. The chapter of pulleys, handwork, politics, and failure. Now the tower has to be rescued, and the man who comes to finish it is about to discover that the real danger to the Washington Monument was never the height. It was hidden underneath the whole thing, in the ground. In 1877, with the nation about to celebrate its 100th birthday and thoroughly embarrassed by the unfinished tower, the work was finally handed to the people who knew how to do hard things at scale: the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The officer put in charge was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lincoln Casey, a West Point-trained engineer who would later go on to build the Library of Congress. And before Casey would lay a single new stone on top, he insisted on looking at the bottom. What he found stopped the project cold. The original foundation, laid back in 1848, was a slab of rubble and mortar resting not on solid bedrock, but on river clay and sand. It was about 80 feet square and only around 20 feet deep. For a stub of 150 feet, it had held. But Casey was being asked to more than triple the height, to pile tens of thousands of additional tons of marble onto that same patch of soft ground. In his judgment, the old foundation simply could not carry the finished tower. Build straight up from it as it was, and over the years the great weight could begin to settle unevenly. And a tower that settles unevenly is a tower that begins to lean. So Casey did something that sounds almost impossible. He decided to rebuild the foundation underneath the monument while the monument was still standing on it. Think about what that means. There is a marble stub 150 feet tall, weighing tens of thousands of tons, sitting on a foundation he has just declared too weak. He cannot take the tower down. He has to slip a new, far larger foundation in underneath the old one without letting the whole thing shift. His engineers did it in careful stages, digging out small sections beneath the edges of the old foundation, a few feet at a time, working on opposite sides at once so the load stayed balanced, and packing each new section with a ring of Portland cement concrete. Slowly, methodically, they wrapped and extended the base until the monument's weight was spread across more than twice the ground it had used before. The work took the better part of a year and was finished in the spring of 1880 at a cost of a little over $94,000. France was so impressed by the feat that it later made Casey an officer of its Legion of Honor. And here is the quiet vindication. More than a century later, modern engineers went back and studied how the monument had settled over its whole life. Their conclusion was that Casey's underpinning had very likely saved the Washington Monument from serious trouble. The most dramatic thing that ever happened to this tower happened underground, before it was even finished, and almost nobody who visits it today has any idea it occurred. We spent weeks going through the old Army Corps reports and the records held in the National Archives to put this part of the story together. And we will be honest with you, the sheer nerve of that foundation rescue surprised even us. With a foundation he could finally trust, Casey could build. And this is where the machine from the very start of our story comes in. This is how you raise 6-ton blocks of marble, hundreds of feet into the air in the 1880s. Inside the hollow shaft, Casey's team erected a tall framework of wrought iron columns, braced and bolted, rising about 30 feet above the top of the finished stone. Mounted on that framework were 4 crane arms, each with its own mast and swinging boom, that could reach out over the walls and set stone on any side. Power came from a steam hoisting engine down at the base, with the boilers housed in a separate building roughly 800 feet away, so that fire and flying sparks stayed well clear of the work. 2 hoisting ropes, each more than 1,000 feet long, ran up the inside of the tower. The lifting machine could raise about 6 tons at a time, with a wide margin of safety, and on a good day, it could make better than 5 full trips an hour up to the working level. Around the base, the site had become a small industrial yard of its own, with heavy derricks, blacksmith forges by the dozen, and thousands of feet of railway laid down to move marble and iron where it was needed. Now here is the elegant part, the part that makes this a genuine machine and not just a crane. The whole iron framework was built to climb. The crews would lay about 20 feet of new marble all the way around. Then they would stop, unbolt the entire iron structure, cranes and hoist guides and all, and jack it up another 20 feet and bolt it down again on top of the fresh stone. Then they would build the next 20 feet and climb again. 20 feet of stone, then 20 feet of machine, over and over, all the way to the top, and by the record of the work, without a single serious accident along the way. And remember, all of this was unfolding at the very same time that, up in New York Harbor, workers were assembling another national monument out of copper and iron, the Statue of Liberty, a build we have a whole film on. The 1880s were the decade when America was learning, in a hurry, how to make truly enormous things. That brings us to something we have to say plainly, because the internet so often gets it wrong. You will find videos and articles claiming that men fell to their deaths building this tower, sometimes even naming them. The official record of the Army engineers tells a very different story. A safety net was stretched beneath the high work, and not one workman is recorded as having died during the construction of the Washington Monument. On other great projects, the danger was terribly real. On the Hoover Dam, decades later, a single steel cable became the deadliest machine on the whole site, a story we have told on this channel. But here in Washington, against every expectation, this tower took no lives at all. For a stone shaft raised more than 500 feet into the sky, decades before any modern safety law existed, that is genuinely remarkable, and it deserves to be remembered correctly. Before we climb the last stretch with Casey's machine, if you are finding this worth your time, please like and subscribe. It keeps these longer films coming. Every one of these documentaries takes days of digging through old records and photographs. And if you would like to help us keep doing exactly that, there is a small donation link waiting for you down in the description. Anything at all helps, and we are grateful for every bit of it. As the tower rose again, it picked up a scar that you can still see from the ground today, if you know to look for it. About a third of the way up, the color of the marble shifts. Most people who notice it assume there is one change, one clean line where the old work meets the new. The truth is a little richer than that. There are actually 3 different marbles in this tower, and 2 seams. The original lower section, the work from the 1840s, was cut from a quarry near a small place in Maryland that happened to be called Texas. That is why old records sometimes speak of Texas marble in a monument in Washington. When Casey restarted the work, the first new marble came from a quarry up in Massachusetts. It did not match the old stone well, and the supply soon ran into problems of quality and cost. So after only a short band of it, the work switched again, back to Maryland marble, but from a different quarry than the original. 3 stones, from 3 places, laid across nearly 40 years. Add in the fact that the older stone and the newer stone have weathered differently over the decades, and you get that famous change of shade partway up the shaft. A permanent fingerprint of just how long and how troubled this construction really was. There is a small irony in that color line. The men finishing the tower in the 1880s tried hard to find marble that would blend in, but quarries close, suppliers fail, and budgets tighten. And in the end, the tower wears its own history on the outside, in 2 faint bands of mismatched stone that no effort could hide. Most visitors never notice it. Once you have seen it, though, you never look at the monument quite the same way again. We are well past the halfway point of the climb now, and from here every foot gets harder, because the tower is about to start closing in on itself. The walls that began 15 feet thick have been thinning all the way up, and near the top, they are down to about 18 inches. Now Casey and his engineer Bernard Green face their last real problem. How do you cap a hollow stone tower with a heavy marble roof when the walls holding it up have grown almost thin enough to lean against? The top of the Washington Monument is not a dome, and it is not flat. It is a pyramid, what engineers call the pyramidion, and it is far heavier than it looks from the ground. This marble peak stands about 55 feet tall on its own and weighs in the neighborhood of 300 tons. Setting 300 tons of stone on top of walls only 1.5 feet thick should not work. The reason it does is a piece of hidden structure. Starting around the 470-foot level, the builders no longer simply stacked stone on stone. They built 12 great marble ribs, 3 on each face, that lean inward and carry the load of the pyramid down and outward into the walls, instead of letting it press straight down on that thin stone. The blocks up there were locked to one another with joints cut directly into the marble, a tongue on one block fitting into a slot on the next, so that the stone roof behaves almost like a single woven cap, rather than a loose pile of slabs. It is the kind of careful, invisible work that holds the whole crown together to this very day. The man who worked out the structure of that peak was Casey's chief assistant, an engineer named Bernard Green, and the care he put into it shows. Near the very top, the stones are no longer the thin-facing slabs of the lower walls, but solid blocks of marble cut to interlock, so that the highest section of the tower is, in effect, a single dense mass of stone rather than a hollow shell. Every joint was fitted dry and checked before it was set, because at that height, with the walls so thin, there was no margin for a stone that did not sit perfectly true. It is slow, exacting work, the kind that never makes the history books, but keeps a tower standing for a century and more. And then there is the very tip. The thing that actually finishes the Washington Monument is a small pyramid of metal, only about 9 inches tall, set right at the apex. And the choice of metal tells you a great deal about the world in 1884. It was made of aluminum. There was a practical reason behind that choice, beyond its rarity. The tip needed to do a job. It was meant to serve as the point of a lightning rod, carrying the enormous charge of a strike safely down and away from the stone. For that, the builders wanted a metal that would not rust or corrode at the very summit, exposed to every storm that rolled across the capital. Aluminum fit the need, and it carried a certain prestige besides. To us today, aluminum is the stuff of soda cans and kitchen foil, about as cheap and common as metal gets. But in 1884, aluminum was so difficult to extract from its ore that it counted as a precious metal, priced by the ounce at roughly the same value as silver. The little cap at the top of the monument was, at the moment it was cast, the largest single piece of pure aluminum that had ever been made anywhere on Earth. It was produced by a chemist in Philadelphia named William Frishmuth, and getting it up onto the tower turned into a small drama all its own. Frishmuth had originally quoted a price of about $75 for the casting. When the work was actually done, his bill had ballooned to more than $250. Casey, an Army officer spending public money, was not pleased and sent one of his captains to Philadelphia to argue it out until they finally settled on $225. And before the piece ever reached Washington, Frishmuth could not resist showing it off. He put the aluminum cap on display in the window of the famous Tiffany jewelry store in New York, where, the story goes, visitors stepped over it on the floor just so they could later say they had stepped clean over the top of the Washington Monument. Casey was furious about the delay and fired off a sharp telegram demanding that Frishmuth stop embarrassing the project and bring the metal point at once. We are almost at the very top now, the last few feet of a climb that took the country 36 years. If you have stayed with us this far, please do like and subscribe. It honestly helps these longer documentaries find the people who love this kind of history. On that aluminum tip, before it ever went up, they engraved words across its four faces, the names and dates of the men and the moment, including the chief engineer, Thomas Lincoln Casey. And on the face that points straight up to the sky, two words in Latin, Laus Deo, praise be to God. That metal point sits on top of a separate marble capstone, a finishing block of stone weighing about 3,300 pounds. On the 6th of December, 1884, at 17 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, that capstone was set into place at the summit. After 36 years of false starts, empty treasuries, a stolen stone, a civil war, and a foundation rebuilt from underneath, the exterior of the Washington Monument was finally complete. When it was done, it stood 555 feet and a fraction into the sky, and it was, at that moment, the tallest structure ever built by human hands. Taller even than the great cathedral at Cologne that had held the record for centuries. The monument would only keep that crown for about 5 years, until a tower of iron went up in Paris, and the Eiffel Tower took the title. But the Washington Monument remains, to this day, the tallest structure of stone in the world. Half a century after it was finished, when the Empire State Building raced into the sky in just over a year, a story we have covered in detail, it did so on a skeleton of steel. The Washington Monument has no such skeleton. It stands on nothing but the weight and the craft of its own marble. The formal dedication came on the 21st of February, 1885, with President Chester A. Arthur presiding in the bitter winter cold. A few years after that, in 1888, the doors opened to the public, and ordinary Americans could finally ride up inside the tower their dollars had helped to build. But the story of the machines does not stop at the dedication, because the monument has had to be carried into the modern world again and again. And the way people reached the top is its own little history of technology. When the tower first opened, getting to the top meant a slow ride on a steam-powered elevator, a journey that took something like 10 to 12 minutes, creeping up the inside of the shaft. That first elevator had actually started life as a piece of construction equipment, a steam freight hoist built to carry stone and iron up the shaft while the tower was still rising. Once the monument was finished, It was fitted out to carry people instead, which is part of why that early ride felt so slow and so unnerving. In those early years, the ride was thought too risky for women and children, who were sent instead to climb the long staircase of 897 steps. And yet the man who ran that elevator later said it was the grown men who seemed the most frightened on the way up. By 1901, the steam elevator was replaced by an electric one that cut the ride to about 5 minutes. And a generation later, once the monument was wired into the city's electric grid, a modern elevator brought the trip down to little more than a minute, which is roughly what it still is today. That aluminum point at the summit has more than earned its keep as a lightning rod. The very next summer after the tower was finished, in 1885, lightning struck it hard enough to crack the stone just below the capstone, and over the years, the strikes kept coming. By the 1930s, when engineers climbed up to inspect the tip, they found that repeated lightning had melted away a small part of the aluminum itself. The summit was eventually fitted with a ring of copper rods to better handle the charge, but the principle has held for well over a century. The tallest thing for miles around is, after all, a marble lightning rod with a metal point. In those same 1930s, crews also poured cement into hollow spaces in the lower walls to strengthen them, and made a careful replica of the capstone, kept on display inside the tower, so visitors can see up close the very stone that crowns the top. The tower has taken its share of hard knocks, too. In August of 2011, a major earthquake of magnitude 5.8, centered out in Virginia, shook the entire region. It was felt by more people than perhaps any earthquake in the history of the eastern United States, and high up in the Washington Monument, it cracked the stone and dislodged pieces of the masonry near the top. The monument was closed. Engineers rappelled down its outer faces on ropes to inspect every joint, and it took until 2014 to repair and reopen, helped along by a single private donation of $7.5 million, matched by public funds. Hundreds of individual stones had been cracked or shifted by the shaking, and as if to drive the point home, a hurricane swept up the coast just days later, driving rain into the wounded tower. The repair work that followed wrapped the entire obelisk in a lattice of scaffolding, lit up at night, so that for a time the Washington Monument glowed against the dark like a strange, towering blue cage. After yet another long modernization of its elevator and systems, it reopened once more in 2019, still standing, still pointing skyward. And even now, almost 140 years after its capstone was set, the Washington Monument finds itself at the center of the nation's arguments with itself. The long reflecting pool that stretches out toward the Lincoln Memorial, in the monument's own shadow, was drained and repainted in 2026 at a cost of more than $13 million. Within days of being refilled, it bloomed a vivid green with algae and floating flecks of paint, drawing lawsuits, headlines, and no small amount of ridicule. The tower itself, as it has done through depression, war, earthquake, and scandal, simply stood at the head of the mall and watched it all happen. We started this film with a single 6-ton block of marble climbing into the sky on a steam machine, decades before hydraulics, before cranes, before a single power tool. By the time you stand at the base of the Washington Monument and look up, you are looking at more than 80,000 tons of marble and stone, raised by steam, rope, and iron, set so finely that the joints all but vanish, balanced on a foundation rebuilt beneath it without ever coming down, and crowned with what was once the most precious cast metal in the country. It is easy to walk past it as a tall white needle on the grass. But when you know how it was made, it stands as one of the most quietly astonishing machines this country has ever built. Thank you for climbing all the way to the top with us. If this is the kind of history you love, please like and subscribe, and we will see you at the next great machine.